Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 12 in a series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. It's my hope that each of these episodes will stand on their own, but if you're the sort of person who likes to have the full context of a story, those earlier episodes are available to listen to at your leisure. Last week, I covered the dawn of the atomic age and the subsequent decline in relations between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies. This week, I will refocus our discussion on the Soviet Union and talk about life in the USSR in the immediate post-war years. This is The End of History, Part 12. When I was a young child, I had a very healthy diet. My mom had a garden in our backyard, and I grew up eating fresh vegetables from our garden and other organic foods from the local health food store. For breakfast, I ate organic, whole grain cereal that tasted like cardboard, and on the rare occasions when we had juice, it was 100% juice with no sugar added. I liked it. It was all I knew, and it never occurred to me that there was anything else out there. Then, one day, I don't remember exactly how old I was, it was probably about 5 or 6. I went to stay with my aunt and my cousins, and there I discovered a pantry full of Cap'n Crunch and Lucky Charms and a refrigerator stocked with Sunny Delight and Hawaiian Punch. For the first time, I ate a bowl of Lucky Charms and washed it down with Sunny D. It was like a whole new world opened up for me. I was floating on a cloud of sucrose and high fructose corn syrup, and I didn't ever want to come down. I did, of course, after a few days of binging on sugar, return home to my ordinary life of cardboard-flavored bran flakes, but it would never be the same. I knew the other stuff existed now. I had seen the mountaintop, and no matter how many times my parents told me it was bad for me, I wanted Lucky Charms. In a way, you could say that the people of the Soviet Union had a similar experience when their soldiers returned home from the conquest of Europe. During the Second World War, millions of Soviet soldiers had marched through Germany and other capitalist states in Central Europe. When the Red Army first crossed into East Prussia in January 1945, they saw rows of large, luxurious houses with backyards and gardens. At first, many of the soldiers assumed that these homes belonged to wealthy capitalists and Nazi elites. In a fit of rage, many of them looted and destroyed these houses. As they advanced further into Germany, however, they continued to encounter more and more such houses. It slowly dawned on them that there were far too many of these houses for them to belong just to the elite upper class. You have to remember that this was, generally speaking, a very young army. Most of the soldiers in the Red Army at this time had been born in the 1920s. Even most of the officers were not old enough to remember a time before the Bolsheviks seized power. The concept of a prosperous middle class was completely alien to them, and they had lived all their lives being told that they had it better than most people in capitalist countries, that in the West, all but a very few rich people lived like destitute wage slaves, constantly exploited by their capitalist overlords. Most Soviets, other than those living in the far west of Ukraine and in the Baltic republics, which had been integrated into the capitalist world during the interwar years, believed this propaganda, because they didn't know any better. It was incredibly rare in the 1920s and 30s for ordinary Soviet citizens, those outside the upper echelon of the Communist Party, to travel outside the Soviet Union. But now, as the Red Army advanced victoriously across Europe, the soldiers saw with their own eyes the truth that had been hidden from them, that people in the capitalist West generally lived better than them, even in Germany, which was completely ravaged by war. Political commissars in the Red Army, those officers tasked with ensuring the proper political consciousness of the soldiers, kicked their propaganda into high gear, relentlessly explaining that the wealth of Germany had only been attained by their plunder of the Soviet Union. They also strictly censored the soldiers' letters home to ensure that they did not leak word back to their families of the material conditions in Germany. but no amount of propaganda or censorship could hide or distort the reality that millions of Red Army soldiers had seen with their own eyes. The truth would eventually leak back to the entire country through word of mouth from the soldiers. Some of you have probably been wondering if, in this series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, I'm ever going to actually get to the part where it starts declining. Well, we're here. I think this mass realization of the disparity in material conditions of life between the capitalist and communist world was one of the most important roots of the decline of the USSR. As effective and sophisticated as Soviet propaganda sometimes was, and as much as many Soviet citizens truly believed in the ideology of communism, there was no putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Most people in the Soviet Union just wanted a better life for themselves and their families, and it was now common knowledge that people in the West had access to a standard of living that was unattainable for them. This knowledge undermined faith in the Soviet system and ultimately became an important factor in its downfall. The problem was exacerbated by the fact that after the war ended, though in terms of its military power and political influence, the USSR had risen to unprecedented heights. For the average Soviet citizen, however, life didn't really improve. This is in stark contrast to how the United States experienced the immediate post-war years. Though there was an initial economic slowdown as war industries were re-geared for a peacetime economy and millions of soldiers returned to the civilian workforce, by the late 1940s, the American economy was booming. The United States was the only major combatant whose infrastructure was entirely untouched by the ravages of war. There was nothing to reconstruct. And rather than having gone into tremendous debt to pay for the war, the United States emerged from the war as a creditor rather than a debtor, allowing it to become the center of world finance. The standard of living rose across the board. The benefits of the GI Bill allowed veterans from diverse economic and racial backgrounds to access higher education for the first time. The GI Bill also opened up opportunities for home ownership, though due to discrimination and policies like redlining, that benefit was largely limited to white veterans, though that's a topic for another day. By contrast, in the Soviet Union, there was no economic boom. The country's infrastructure, particularly its agricultural sector, had been completely devastated by the war. According to a 1946 report from Stalin's economic administrator, 1,700 towns had been destroyed. 70,000 villages or hamlets were burned to the ground. 32,000 factories were destroyed or rendered useless. 52,000 miles of railway tracks were destroyed, and over 100,000 state or collective farms were laid waste. In total, he estimated that the USSR had lost roughly 30% of its wealth during the war. Ukraine, the USSR's largest food-producing region, had suffered comparatively more than the other Soviet republics, losing roughly 40% of its wealth. In 1941, the Red Army had destroyed crops, burned farms, and slaughtered livestock as they retreated in a scorched earth campaign, determined to leave nothing of use for the Germans. In 1944, the Germans did the same as they retreated back across Ukraine. It would be decades before food production in Ukraine and the agricultural regions of Western Russia that had been occupied by the Germans returned to their pre-war levels. The food shortages were made worse by the government returning to its pre-war policy of forcing the peasantry onto less productive, even in the best of times, collective farms, and imposing unrealistic quotas of tons of grain that had to be handed over to the state. This, in effect, amounted to a return to the food confiscations of the 1930s, and with the same result. Famine gripped the countryside. Nikita Khrushchev, often anglicized to Khrushchev, the chairman of the Ukrainian Communist Party and the man destined to succeed Stalin as general secretary, did his best to alleviate the suffering. But without the support of Stalin and the Moscow party apparatus, there was little he could do. Khrushchev was also limited by his own dogmatic attachment to communist orthodoxy and commitment to Stalinist principles like collectivization. but he does seem to have been truly moved by the suffering of the Ukrainian people. He was so moved that he even risked his own life and career writing directly to Stalin and telling him the truth about the plight of the people. In the lead up to the 1946 harvest, Khrushchev could see that the projections from the central planners in Moscow were completely unrealistic. He wrote in his memoirs later that he thought if he presented his argument with facts and figures, providing plenty of evidence to Stalin personally, he hoped he could overcome the bureaucratic inertia of the 5-year plan and win Stalin's support for a system of rationing that would ensure at least a minimal amount of food was set aside for Ukrainian farmers to avoid a famine like the one they had experienced in the 1930s. Stalin was not receptive to the plan. Khrushchev later wrote, quote, "Stalin sent me the rudest, most insulting telegram, declaring that I was a suspicious element, that I was writing memoranda falsely claiming that Ukraine couldn't fulfill its state procurement orders, and wrongly asking for a huge number of ration cards to feed people. This telegram had a devastating effect on me. I understood that tragedy now hung over not just me personally, but over the Ukrainian people, over the Republic. Starvation had become unavoidable, and it soon began." End quote. A quick note on Khrushchev's memoirs. It's one of my sources for this episode and for several more episodes in the near future. Though it is a valuable primary source for the period, it should usually be taken with a grain of salt. It was, after all, written by Khrushchev himself, and very obviously intended to cast him in the most positive light. In this case, however, Khrushchev's efforts to avert famine in Ukraine by appealing to Stalin are well documented and corroborated, so I don't see any reason to doubt the veracity of the account in his memoirs. Just as Khrushchev predicted, famine did overtake Ukraine and many other regions of the Soviet Union in 1946 and 1947. It was not as severe as the Great Famine of the 1930s, which we covered in episode 5, but it is estimated that about 900,000 Soviet citizens starved to death. Like in the Great Famine before it, the victims of the famine were disproportionately, but not exclusively, Ukrainian. About 1/3 of the total deaths attributed to the famine were in Ukraine. As with the previous man-made famines of the Stalin regime, the impact was felt mostly in the countryside. The urban workers, necessary to keep Stalin's industrial machine going, did not starve to death in great numbers, as the food confiscated from the starving rural population was mostly given to them. But that does not mean life was necessarily a paradise for the country's city dwellers. The biggest problem facing the cities of the USSR in the late 1940s was a severe housing shortage. During the war, people had flooded into major cities like Moscow, both refugees fleeing the war and others in search of opportunity working in the war factories. As a side note, a similar urbanization phenomenon was experienced in the United States during the war as people migrated from the countryside into major cities in search of war work. In the USSR, after the war ended, most of these people stayed in the cities, and there was a need for them, as even with the coming of peace, there was a constant need for industrial production to keep the Soviet Union's military machine churning. While the United States military largely demobilized after 1945, with the soldiers returning to civilian life relatively quickly, the Soviet Union chose not to do this. Stalin made the decision to keep the Red Army under arms on a wartime footing for years after the war. Most Soviet soldiers did not go home or return to civilian life right away. There are a few reasons for this. Primarily, it was a strategic decision. Stalin wanted to keep the army large and ready for immediate action as a counterweight to the American nuclear monopoly, which we talked about last week. Second, these soldiers provided an imposing force behind the Sovietization of Eastern Europe that was happening at this time. A majority of people in countries like Poland were not necessarily in favor of the communist governments being imposed on them, and the presence of millions of Red Army soldiers armed to the teeth in support of these satellite regimes helped to deter any local opposition. Third, there was Stalin's paranoia. As I discussed before, many of these Soviet soldiers had seen things in Europe that Stalin thought might cause them to oppose his regime. He was concerned about these soldiers bringing counter-revolutionary ideas home with them. This paranoia was informed by Stalin's understanding of the experience of the Tsarist regime with the Decembrist revolt of 1825, led by Russian army officers who had brought the ideas of the French Revolution home with them after the defeat of Napoleon. Finally, soldiers could also be used for non-military purposes, and in many cases, Red Army units were used as a sort of mobile workforce that could be readily moved around the country wherever their labor was needed. For instance, units of Red Army soldiers were almost always deployed to work on collective farms during the harvest, to supplement the labor of the collective farmers. In short, what all this meant is that there was a great need for the Soviet war machine to keep turning out supplies for a massive army, even in peacetime, and so the workers who had migrated to the cities during the war would not be going anywhere. Most people in the cities did not have their own apartments. That was a privilege at the time reserved mostly just for the elite leaders of the Communist Party. Instead, most people lived in kommunalki, or communal apartments, which were typically occupied by multiple families. Historian Gary Hamburg cites an estimate that the average Soviet urban dweller was allotted just 5 square meters of space. For those of you unfamiliar with the metric system, that is just a little bit bigger than a king-size mattress, so not a lot of personal space or privacy. As soldiers did eventually start to rotate home, the problem got even worse. When the problem got bad enough, the government eventually launched a project to construct large, prefabricated apartment buildings in cities all over the country. These aren't the Soviet public housing buildings that can still be found in every city in the former Soviet Union. Those ones were built later, and with slightly better materials and craftsmanship. The Stalin-era apartment buildings are pretty rare, as the construction was so shoddy, most of them deteriorated and collapsed within a decade or two, only to be replaced by the slightly better Khrushchevki, named after the man who spearheaded the project in the 1950s and 60s. While these buildings were poorly constructed, often to the point of being unsafe, and overcrowded, the construction did alleviate the worst of the housing shortage. However, the issue of housing will come up again in this series, as the lack of adequate housing was a problem that plagued the Soviet Union right up until its final days, and continues to plague modern Russia. It's one of the reasons that today, Moscow is among the most expensive places to live in the world, right up there with the likes of New York and London. It was not just the material conditions of life that did not improve for the Soviet people after the war. The Stalinist repressions had never completely gone away, and in fact had continued throughout the war in one form or another, but they had faded from the forefront of many people's minds as they faced an existential struggle for survival. In the immediate aftermath of victory, some Soviet citizens, like their Western counterparts, had a great deal of hope that the war had not just been a struggle for survival, but a great effort to create a better world and a freer Soviet Union. The famed Russian nuclear physicist and future Nobel Prize winner Andrei Sakharov remembered of this time, quote, "We all believed, or at least hoped, that the post-war world would be decent and humane. How could it be otherwise?" End quote. Boris Pasternak, the famed author known for his greatest work, Dr. Zhivago, was also optimistic. He wrote that the end of the war seemed to be a, quote, "an omen of deliverance. So many sacrifices cannot result in nothing. A presage of freedom is in the air," end quote. Of course, no such freedom was forthcoming. Having emerged victorious from the war, Stalin would return to the repression and brutality that had been the hallmarks of his rule before the war. Mikhail Gorbachev, then a law student at Moscow State University, later said of this time, quote, "The slightest deviation from the official line, any attempt to question anything, was fraught with consequences, culminating at best in scrutiny before a komsomol or party meeting." End quote. Komsomol is the abbreviation for the Communist Youth Union, the Communist Party's youth organization to which most ambitious young people belonged. Gorbachev was a leader in his local Komsomol chapter, and a candidate for full party membership, which would be approved in 1952. We will have cause to talk about Mikhail Gorbachev quite a bit down the road, but we're not quite at that part of the story yet. Many of Stalin's repressions of this time followed a familiar pattern that emerged with the Great Purge, which we covered in episode 5. The denunciation of a few high-ranking party officials, followed by a comprehensive investigation, complete with forced confessions obtained under torture, and the arrest and imprisonment of many more, as the investigation inevitably revealed a far-reaching plot against Stalin and the Soviet Union. This is how the so-called Leningrad affair unfolded in 1949. Leningrad had always been the Soviet Union's second city. It was the second largest after Moscow and had been the capital of the revolution. And the Leningrad party leaders and other politicians commanded a great deal of respect and carried a great deal of weight in the Communist Party apparatus, even before the war. During the war, Leningrad had been cut off and besieged by the Germans and Finns. This meant not only that the party leadership operated with a great deal of autonomy and independence from Moscow throughout the war, but that when the war ended, many of them had emerged as war heroes, popular and renowned not just in Leningrad, but around the USSR. If there was one thing Stalin hated more than anything else, it was being outshone by his potential political rivals. In January 1949, 3 prominent leaders of the Leningrad Communist Party, Pyotr Popkov, Alexei Kuznetsov, and Nikolai Voznesensky, organized and promoted a trade conference in the city that they hoped would revitalize the city's economy, which had been devastated by the war and had yet to recover. A formal accusation followed from Georgy Malenkov, Stalin's chief deputy on the Communist Party Central Committee, that the 3 men were using the trade conference as a ploy to embezzle state funds and to enrich themselves and their city at the expense of other regions of the USSR. The accusation came from Malenkov's mouth, but they were almost certainly Stalin's words. Malenkov was a loyal deputy of Stalin, not known for taking bold unilateral action. The formal accusation would later be signed by Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD secret police, and Nikita Khrushchev, who had recovered from his earlier disagreement with Stalin over the famine in Ukraine and had been elevated by Stalin to the Politburo in Moscow. Despite their disagreements, Stalin liked Khrushchev. He is said to have enjoyed Khrushchev's humor and capacity for heavy drinking, something Stalin shared. I also think that deep down, despite his paranoia and megalomania, or perhaps because of it, Stalin appreciated having someone in the room who was willing to tell him the truth. Though he was certainly very judicious about when and how he stood up to Stalin, Khrushchev was known for doing this from time to time, the Ukraine famine being just one of a few examples over the years. Years later, in his memoir, Khrushchev attempted to distance himself from the Leningrad affair, essentially pleading ignorance and saying that he knew nothing about it. This is almost certainly not true. As a member of the Politburo, he was privy to all high-level discussions within the party, and his signature, which does not appear to be forged, is on the document bringing the formal accusations. Following the familiar pattern, the 3 men initially accused were arrested and tortured until they confessed and named more accomplices, who were in turn arrested and tortured until they confessed and named even more accomplices. In the end, 6 men were executed, including Popkov, Kuznetsov, and Voznesensky. Just over 200 were sentenced to imprisonment in the Gulag. Their families were also punished and sent into exile. And over 2,000 other party members were publicly disgraced, exiled from the city, and removed from their positions. Finally, in the post-war years, Stalin's personal anti-Semitism, which had lain dormant for years beneath a veneer of official inclusiveness, finally reared its ugly head into official state policy. Stalin had always disliked and distrusted Jews. It's unclear where the prejudice originated, but it's fair to say that it was probably ingrained in him in childhood. As I addressed briefly in an earlier episode, anti-Semitism was a common prejudice in the old Russian Empire, and it was officially endorsed and spread by the Tsarist regime. As a loyal lieutenant of Lenin who reviled anti-Semitism, And a true believer in the Bolshevik ideology, Stalin rejected official anti Semitism throughout most of his political career, though he was never able to shake off the prejudice in his personal life. This began to change in the late 1940s with the creation of the State of Israel. Stalin had been an early supporter of the Zionist project, and the Soviet Union was actually the first country to formally recognize and establish diplomatic relations with Israel in 1948. This is because Stalin believed that with many Jewish socialists, including many with Soviet citizenship, among the early Israeli population, that the Jewish state would turn socialist and become an ally of the USSR in the brewing Cold War. To his dismay, the opposite happened, as Israel moved closer to and aligned their politics with the West, especially with the United States. Stalin saw this as a betrayal, and he feared that the USSR's large Jewish population would ultimately be loyal to Israel, and therefore the Soviet Union's adversaries. He saw any Jewish organization in the USSR with ties to Israel or the West as a potential fifth column, and he launched a campaign of repression against members of such organizations. One of the main targets of this repression was the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, an organization started by Soviet Jews during the war with the aim of influencing public opinion abroad and encouraging Jews around the world, but especially in the United States, to support the Soviet Union's war effort against the Nazis. When the war ended, the organization did not dissolve, but shifted to other priorities, including spreading awareness and documenting the facts of the Holocaust, something that went against the official Soviet line, as Soviet propaganda preferred to frame all the Soviet people as the main victims of the Nazis and discouraged singling out the oppression of Jews. In January 1948, the group's chairman, Solomon Michols, was assassinated in Minsk, and other members of the organization were quickly arrested and charged with disloyalty, bourgeois nationalism, cosmopolitanism, and a litany of other offenses. Some were executed and others imprisoned in the Gulag. Among those executed was Dr. Boris Shimolyevich, the medical director of Moscow's Botkin Hospital. What followed was a campaign of mass hysteria aimed at inciting people against, quote, rootless cosmopolitanism, a phrase that everybody understood was equated with the Jewish identity. Many of the most prominent Jewish authors, artists, and poets were rounded up and arrested or shot. The doctors were next. A Soviet cardiologist, Dr. Lydia Timoshuk, made a formal accusation in 1948 that a group of mostly Jewish doctors were falsifying medical records in support of a conspiracy to poison the leadership of the Soviet Union, including Stalin. From my research, it's unclear what her motivation for making this accusation was, but the accusation was wholly uncorroborated and unsubstantiated, and was even ignored by Stalin at the time it was made. Then, 3 years later, in March 1951, a Jewish doctor with ties to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, Yaakov Ettinger, was accused of medical malpractice in his treatment of the Politburo member Andrei Zhdanov, who had died in 1948. Ettinger was arrested and succumbed to torture, passing away in his prison cell shortly after being arrested. Before he died, he had apparently implicated several other Jewish doctors in an alleged plot to poison Stalin. Georgy Malenkov and Lavrenti Beria were appointed by Stalin to launch an open-ended investigation into this plot. They revived the 3-year-old allegations made by Dr. Timoshuk, arresting all of the doctors on her list. Just as these doctors were being prepared for a massive show trial in Moscow, where they were certain to be found guilty and executed, on March 1st, 1953, Stalin suffered a hemorrhagic stroke in his study after retiring for the evening. 4 days later, on March 5th, 1953, after nearly 3 decades in power, Joseph Stalin died, leaving the Soviet Union with a massive power vacuum. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I encourage you to engage with us on social media and to visit our website at www.thehistorysphere.com. If you like what you heard and want to support the podcast, you can support us through Spotify with a monthly donation. If you don't have Spotify or you prefer to listen elsewhere, you can also support us on Patreon. The link to our Patreon can be found on the website. As always, I would like to thank the Blake Annex for providing me with the space I'm using in this studio to record this podcast. Next time, on the History Sphere, I will talk about the death of Stalin and the struggle between his deputies over the succession and the future course of the USSR. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.